It was a time when the eyes of the entire world were on the Soviet Union. The old guard was losing its grip on power, and a new regime was taking shape. What exactly that would look like, nobody could say. Suddenly, the whole world could speak a few words of Russian. The most important, Perestroika.
It was a rather torturous process that people are just learning about now.
The world's biggest country was in turmoil, boiling over, self-destructing, and being born again.
2 weeks after I got there, Mikhail Gorbachev said the word glasnost for the first time.
The echo of those intense events, now a quarter of a century ago, can still be heard today, both in a new Russia and around the globe. The early 1980s marked the height of a Soviet period that was later characterized as stagnation. By 1982, the country had been led for 17 years by Leonid Brezhnev, who was by now a feeble and sick old man. Along with his allies, known as the Kremlin Old Guard, Brezhnev's leadership strategy was to maintain the status quo.
Our positions became weakened in the late 1970s. Growth rates were on the wane. When Andropov came to power, we had zero growth. Actually, we had negative growth rates.
Andropov rose to the peak of Soviet leadership when Brezhnev died in November 1982. Before the handover, he'd headed the KGB, the most powerful and notorious of Soviet institutions.
In one of his speeches, Andropov said this: "We need to understand what kind of society we've built." Those were his own words. In the context of those dogmatic times, that sounded like a dissident phrase.
Andropov was also elderly and in poor health. He died after just 13 months in office. His replacement, Konstantin Chernenko, was even more fragile. The sequence of Kremlin deaths was referred to by many as the gun carriage race, which loosely means the race to the graveyard. In 1985, Gorbachev was 54. Many thought he was too young to head the government. The decision was made by competing influential alliances within the top brass, each with their own motives.
The plenum elected Comrade Mikhail Gorbachev as the General Secretary of the CPSU Central Committee.
The Kremlin Old Guard wanted nothing more than a comfortable semi-retirement. They saw in Gorbachev an inexperienced politician with peasant roots that they could easily manipulate.
When Gorbachev got nominal power, he had not yet won real authority in the party or the state.
By contrast, the few advocates of reform hoped that this relatively young and energetic man would be able to transform the nation. Gorbachev delivered a key report on economic reform just a month after taking the nation's top post in March 1985.
Here we have a deeply developed strategy, a program of Perestroika that has been thought through and suffered.
Initially, Perestroika was meant to affect only the economy. Later, the word also came to imply other issues. The report was based on what had been done under Andropov.
The old party leadership viewed the young leader's ideas with suspicion. In such an intensely indoctrinated country, popular opinion was about as insignificant as it was difficult to gauge.
During my first days in power, it suddenly occurred to me that I must go out and listen to what people had to say.
It was the first time ever that a Soviet leader met with the people in such a spontaneous manner. A head of state, face to face with the public, in a country where politics had long been conducted behind closed doors. It was a sensation.
Please be closer to the people.
I'm as close as can be.
Soviet television gave wide coverage to Gorbachev's numerous trips and encounters with the people. He turned into a TV star, with his popularity overshadowing even the country's favorite performers. The party's top echelon and regional functionaries grew increasingly uneasy about Gorbachev's popularity and his determination to push for economic reform.
I had no team at all. I had to put it together from scratch.
By 1986, half of the party at high level had been replaced with younger people. Gorbachev counted among his key allies Boris Yeltsin, who became head of the Moscow party apparatus and a member of the powerful Politburo. The people supported their leader. A team of reformers was set to go ahead with the changes, but there was a catastrophic shortfall in funding for fully fledged reforms. The arms race and Cold War commitments accounted for the lion's share of a budget already in the red.
Let's get rid of the threats of the Cold War.
Gorbachev met with American President Ronald Reagan in Geneva in November 1985. The one-on-one meeting lasted around 40 minutes.
When I emerged from the meeting, I was asked about my impressions. A veritable dinosaur, I said. When Reagan was asked the same question, he said, a die-hard Bolshevik. But a couple of days later, those two diehards produced a joint statement that the whole world had expected to hear.
John Matlock was an American ambassador to Russia during the Perestroika years. He knew just how difficult it was to move from strong enemies to good friends.
I think that the victory for Gorbachev, he was able to, with the cooperation of Reagan and the first President Bush, was able to end the Cold War. It took both of them to do it. Their cooperation was what did it. You can't say that one was a victor over the other, because every agreement we made was in the interest of both countries.
On January the 1st, 1986, the people of the two nations saw the first New Year's greetings by both a US president and a Soviet leader.
I'm very glad to congratulate the American people with the new year.
Good evening. This is Ronald Reagan, President of the United States. I'm speaking to you, the peoples of the Soviet Union, on the occasion of the new year.
The climate of relations with foreign countries was getting warmer. But domestic issues were still pressing. The planned economy had become second nature to bureaucrats at all levels. They could distribute things, but they couldn't turn in a profit. New economic programs were not working.
As far as I can gather, Gorbachev and his closest associates played a big part there. They realized they couldn't wring the neck of the party's top echelon. They knew they should seek grassroots support.
In 1989, Yevgeny Yasin was put in charge of the State Commission for Economic Reform, a rank on a par with government ministers. He served in that position up until the collapse of the Soviet Union. Today, he's the president and founder of the Higher School of Economics. Yevgeny still holds seminars to train economic experts in modern Russia.
When somebody at the top suggests that people should no longer be sent to prison or labor camps and should be given a measure of freedom, that was it. The decisions bore the stamp of approval by millions of people. But at some point, things began breaking out of control.
Ellen O'Connor became a CNN correspondent in Russia during the second year of Perestroika. She watched the radical changes unfold in the mass media very closely. Topics that had never been raised before started to appear on the pages of Soviet newspapers. People were no longer afraid to speak their mind or attend many informal meetings that were taking place across the country.
I remember with my Western colleagues, Western reporters, we would sit in those meetings and sort of look at each other and kind of pinch ourselves and say, I'm sitting with the founding fathers, just like it might have been 200 years ago in this country at the Continental Congress, watching people debate what country they're going to have.
The topics were not only achievements and prospects. The endless problems were also on everyone's minds.
It's too bad that more people in civil society, more people at the grassroots of Russian society are not really as economically benefited or politically benefited as I think many people hoped. So I think that's a disappointment. And where to put the blame, who knows?
The Kemerovo region in central Siberia is one of Russia's major coal-producing areas. People going down the mines every day have a particularly strong feeling of camaraderie. The Soviet Union's first mass strikes began in the coal mining areas. On one occasion, 500,000 workers in various parts of the country went on strike almost simultaneously.
No one was working. They said, "Go back." So we took a bus and went to the square.
Yes, and gosh, do you remember how many people were there?
Vladimir Zotov, a retired miner, remembers the events of those days frequently with his former colleagues. His team was the first to go on strike.
We didn't put forward political demands. We didn't try to change the system. What we did want was to change the attitude of the party bureaucracy for us, the workers. Now, if you over there have decided to launch Perestroika, okay, let's do it together. Mr. Gorbachev, you start from above, and we'll start from below.
Many coal mines were given a measure of independence. Now the cash available to the miners directly depended on coal sales. Basically, that's what compelled them to strike.
We'll stand here until the final decision's made.
Prime Minister Nikolai Ryzhkov, who himself came from a mining family, went to negotiate with the miners. The negotiations involved some very hard words.
When Ryzhkov came here to face people from all over this town, his facial expression abruptly changed. He'd realized that here were the people he was supposed to be working for. It wasn't just a faceless mob.
I would have liked to see you facing coal miners and talking to them. I can tell you it's not a pleasant experience.
He knew he had to say something to them. What did he say? We'll think about it and make a decision. That's what he said. At that moment, the black-faced mass of people with coal dust all over their overalls breathed out as one. Enough is enough. This was our first slogan. Enough thinking. Speak up now, or you'll have no other chance.
The differences seemed to defy solution. Only Soviet entrepreneurs could find a common language with the miners. First, private companies were called cooperatives, and businessmen, cooperators.
We're against the conmen. We're against the resellers. But we're not against the cooperatives.
The cooperators were ready to take the responsibility upon themselves and pay the salaries of thousands of miners.
We'll tell them we'd start selling coal at a high price and we'll introduce innovations in the coal mines.
The law on cooperatives was the first timid attempt to allow private entrepreneurship in the Soviet Union. Artyom Tarasov was the first Soviet millionaire. His cooperative made its money supplying computers. Given that foreign currency exchange was banned in the Soviet Union, Artyom brought some of his first dollars from prostitutes working in hotels for foreigners.
$500, for example, could get you a computer like this one. It took some 5 days to bring the computer into the country. We officially sold it to an enterprise willing to buy it. So a $500 computer fetched us nearly 500,000 rubles, or nearly $170,000.
By that time, the so-called New Russians, or lucky cooperative workers, quickly earned huge sums of money, while the vast majority of their countrymen faced growing hardship.
The close-up team has been to the Sakhalin region, where the biggest Russian salmon caviar processing factory is located. Now, RT goes to Northern Paradise, where many still live off the land, where new ways are being found to fight economic turmoil, and where Russia's first free elections were held 1,000 years ago. Welcome to the Novgorod region. Russia Close-Up on RT.
42,000 Americans die each year from car accidents. Only 1,000 die in plane crashes. 17,000 people will be murdered, and 32,000 will kill themselves. Cancer in all its forms kills 560,000 of us a year. Heart disease is even more devastating. It kills over 870,000 Americans every year.
Rationing was introduced in the Soviet Union in 1989 for the first time since the end of the Second World War. Some items were sold in strictly limited quantities. Nobody could buy more than 200 grams of butter at a time. No more than 10 packs of cigarettes. Long queues and empty shelves were the hallmark of the times. A wave of strikes and spontaneous rallies demanding a curb on prices swept the country.
Soviet people are dying.
A communist country that had been preaching friendship and unity among its people for nearly 70 years saw its first serious ethnic disturbances. These turned into a massive wave in the Soviet borderlands that eventually broke the massive empire. Lithuania was one of the Soviet republics swamped by nationalist demonstrations and unrest.
There was a platform put up for the first mass rally in June 1988. Speakers talked about freedom, and then everybody started singing the Lithuanian national anthem. But many people couldn't sing because they were crying. They knew something was changing. There was more openness. There was a glimpse of freedom. People could now talk freely, without fear.
Vytautas Landsbergis is a composer and professor at the Vilnius Conservatory. He always pictured himself at the head of an orchestra, not the head of a nation. He became the rallying point for a host of disconnected new political forces in Lithuania, which united in an association called Sąjūdis.
We wanted Perestroika to go through to the end. Yes, we wanted to see changes in the economy, more glasnost and more freedom of expression, but we also wanted to be free in decision-making.
Glasnost, the Russian word for openness proclaimed by Gorbachev, looked ever more like a genie let out of the bottle. For the first time, infighting among the Soviet elite became a matter of debate in the media. Boris Yeltsin was unhappy about the slow, half-hearted progress of reforms. He publicly demanded that the party's leaders initiate more vigorous and thorough transformations. Sensing a potential rival, Gorbachev booted Yeltsin from the Politburo and stripped him of his seat at the top of the Moscow party organization.
He who claims that he can solve everything for the better when he comes to power is a political crook.
In the old days, this would have spelled the end of a political career.
And I can't forgive myself for being too liberal and didn't send Boris Yeltsin where I should have. That was my mistake.
The liberal press now saw Yeltsin as a political martyr and man of the people. Yeltsin vigorously backed any democratic initiatives such as freedom of speech and market reforms. The then Prime Minister, Nikolai Ryzhkov, asked Gorbachev not to rush with the political reforms in the country.
I used to tell Gorbachev many times, we have to stop all of that. We will lose the country. Tomorrow I will resign, and tomorrow you will be left on your own with Yeltsin and the same team. You won't last for long. But he lasted for a year.
Nikolai Ryzhkov resigned in December 1990. By that time, Gorbachev's ratings had plummeted. By contrast, Boris Yeltsin became the people's favorite politician. He was the first high-profile Russian official to show his hobbies in public.
Boris Yeltsin always was a sporting man with a fighting spirit, one who kept himself fit. That was especially true of tennis. It made for easier contact with his party colleagues.
By 1990, Gennady Burbalis had become Yeltsin's right-hand man both on the court and in government. Yeltsin appreciated people's fighting spirit. Many of his associates had to learn to play tennis.
They did discuss politics in the locker room.
There was no getting away from that.
Yeltsin himself played tennis quite well. Political tennis was another of his strong points. He was good at attacking and counter-attacking his opponents by exploiting their weaknesses. He conflicted with the Kremlin's position by backing republics when they bid for independence. In 1990, Vytautas Landsbergis was elected chairman of the Lithuanian parliament. Under his leadership, the body immediately proclaimed the Baltic Republic's independence.
In January 1991, we received an ultimatum from Gorbachev demanding that Lithuania should admit that the Soviet constitution was again in force in our country. That's to say, he recognized the fact that it was already null and void here. He threatened to use military force unless we rejoin the Soviet Union.
A detachment of armored vehicles and special forces units entered Vilnius. The Lithuanians started building fortifications around the building of their new parliament using concrete blocks and barbed wire. Later, part of the barricades were put under glass walls and turned into the museum for the Republic's independence.
The barbed wire symbolizes the oppression, the prisons, the camps, and the borders.
The Kremlin hoped a demonstration of force would be enough to compel the young republic to make concessions.
We said we had no right. We'd not been elected to have the country rejoin the Soviet Union. A massacre followed.
The television center was attacked in the early hours of January the 13th. The building was soon captured and the work of independent Lithuanian television shut down.
Hello. We are being attacked. We can hear shots coming from all sides. The Lithuanian radio station has already been captured. We're still...
Egile Bachelita is still an anchor on a state-run television channel. That was the report which sealed her fame as a young journalist.
They broke the door with their axes. This patch has been left here as a reminder of those events.
Back in the Kremlin, some of the top brass was still in denial. A hastily drafted new Union treaty was designed to keep the USSR together. It was the result of joint work by delegates representing 9 out of 15 republics. The treaty was scheduled to be signed on August the 20th, 1991. But unexpected events that broke out in Moscow a day earlier buried all hopes for the preservation of what was left of the Soviet Union.
We really didn't let them sign the Soviet Union agreement on August the 19th. That's right. But its creators could sign it the next day.
After toppling Gorbachev from power, 8 elite party officials designated themselves as the State Emergency Committee. All television programming was replaced with Tchaikovsky's ballet Swan Lake and committee members addressing the nation. Their proclaimed political program has faded into memory. But the trembling hands of State Emergency Committee Chairman Gennady Yanayev were the most symbolic sign of their coup. Tanks on Moscow's streets, a coup in the world's biggest nuclear state. CNN's Moscow correspondent Ellen O'Connor had taken that day off. She spent a whole year gathering the correct paperwork to adopt a Russian girl, called Marina, from a Moscow orphanage. On August the 19th, 1991, the final meeting was scheduled.
In the meantime, of course, there were tanks all over the streets, and there was a huge line of tanks between me and the office. So I literally ran.
That story had a happy ending. Marina lived in Russia with her new mom until she was 9. Then the entire O'Connor family moved to the US. Marina remembers well the primary school she attended in Russia and dreams of visiting her native country after she graduates from an American university.
Do you consider Russia your home?
I don't really have like one. I have homes everywhere. It's still like that now. Like right now, I'm living in 3 places. Like my boyfriend's like, I don't know what to call home. Like I don't.
Moscow, August 1991. Boris Yeltsin was one of the most active opponents of the State Emergency Committee. The committee itself was deposed on the 21st, and all its ringleaders landed in jail.
No doubt the way the Soviet Union collapsed was a sad event. It was a tragedy. But when that happened, the Soviet treasury was empty. There was a dislocated economy, and there was a real threat of famine. More importantly, governance had broken down with unpredictable consequences. From a bloody civil war to nuclear weapons landing in the hands of uncontrollable forces. But we've managed to prevent all that.
December the 8th, 1991 saw the last chapter in the history of the Soviet Union with the appearance of the Belevej Agreements. They confirmed the statehood of the former Soviet republics and the emergence of a new political entity, the Commonwealth of Independent States. The agreements were signed by two top-ranking officials representing each of the republics. Yeltsin and Burbalis represented Russia.
That document is a masterpiece of 20th century diplomacy. A vast empire crammed with nuclear weapons and an enormous backlog of deep-seated problems that had piled up over more than 70 years broke up almost peacefully.
December the 8th, 1991 was also the Soviet Union's official last day. It also marked the end of Perestroika. One country gave way to 15, each of them which subsequently followed its own path.